The Civil Rights Movement. We all know what happened. The simple version. Americans were racists, Martin Luther King marched, protested, gave his famous speech, and segregation ended as white and black little girls and boys held hands and walked off into the sunset as America became the post-racial democracy powerhouse that it is today, granting equal rights and opportunities to all of its citizens. Right? At least, that's the story we're taught in school. From the ages of 10 to 18, elementary school to high school, the Civil Rights Movement is a unit every history and social studies class teaches. We're taught the same things every year. Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat, Martin Luther King Jr. protested and gave his speech, segregation was ruled unconstitutional in the Brown v. Board of Education case, and racial equality was achieved. But that's just not the whole story. When you think about the Civil Rights Movement, you think about how successful it was. But was it really? What exactly did the Civil Rights Movement achieve that makes it considered so successful? Judicially, legislatively, and legally, the Civil Rights Movement was a success. They were able to achieve equality for African Americans in these regards. However, in terms of actual equality and the termination of discrimination in American society, this is where, unfortunately, the Civil Rights Movement failed.
The name of this tune is Mississippi Goddamn.
On December 1st, 1955, Rosa Parks, an African-American seamstress at a local department store, was commuting home on the Montgomery bus. She found an empty seat in the front row of the colored section. However, all the seats in the white section became filled, and the bus driver asked Rosa and 3 other African-Americans to give up their seats for white passengers. The 3 other African-Americans stood up, vacating their seats, but Rosa Parks refused, remaining seated. As a result, she was arrested and fined $10 with an additional $4 in court fees. Today, this would be a $95.56 fine with the additional $38.22 in court fees, totaling to $133.78, just for refusing to give up her seat. At the time, Rosa Parks was also the secretary for the local chapter of the NAACP. Parks was essentially chosen to be the face of what would be the Montgomery bus boycott. The NAACP knew that if they wanted to successfully go through with the boycott, they would need the perfect person to be the catalyst. 9 months prior to Rosa Parks' arrest, 15-year-old Claudette Colvin did the same thing she did, and yet was not chosen to be the face of the boycott. Why? Because of black respectability. Claudette refused to give up her seat to a white woman on the bus, and was arrested for this refusal. This incident was originally planned to be the beginning of the boycott. However, soon after, the NAACP discovered that Colvin was pregnant. Because of this, they felt that she wouldn't be an appropriate symbol for the boycott, since it would likely be very difficult for the community to respect and rally behind her because of that. The NAACP and Women's Political Council decided together that they would wait for another chance with a different individual to begin the boycott around, and this person came to be Rosa Parks. On December 5th, 1955, 4 days after Rosa Parks' arrest, a meeting was organized at the Holt Street Baptist Church, where Martin Luther King Jr. gave another famous speech of his, calling for a bus boycott, to which the community readily agreed and complied with.
But we are here in a specific sense because of the bus situation in Montgomery. We are here because we are determined to get the situation corrected. This situation is not at all new. The problem has existed over endless years. Just the other day, just last Thursday to be exact, one of the finest citizens in Montgomery, not one of the finest Negro citizens, but one of the finest citizens in Montgomery, was taken from a bus and carried to jail and arrested because she refused to get up to give her seat to a white person. Mrs. Rosa Parks is a fine person, and since it had to happen, I'm happy that it happened to a person like Mrs. Parks. And nobody can doubt the boundless outreach of her integrity. Nobody can doubt the height of her character. Nobody can doubt the depth of her Christian commitment and devotion to the teachings of Jesus. And I'm happy since it had to happen. It happened to a person that nobody his integrity and character there. And just because she refused to get up, she was arrested.
It's clear that Rosa Parks was the perfect candidate to be the catalyst for the Montgomery bus boycott. The African American community worked together to successfully boycott the buses. Many people began biking and walking to get around, and a system of carpools was organized where car owners would volunteer their vehicles to be used or themselves as drivers to bring people to various destinations to avoid using the buses. To support the boycott, black taxi drivers charged 10 cents per ride, which was the fare for bus rides. The boycott proved to be extremely effective, and as it continued, buses began receiving fewer and fewer passengers, to the point where some buses were even empty at times. The boycott continued for 381 days, and on June 4, 1956, the Alabama Federal Court ruled that the laws in place to keep buses segregated were unconstitutional. When Alabama appealed the decision, the boycott continued, and the case moved on to the U.S. Supreme Court, where they upheld the district court's ruling, agreeing and stating that segregation on public buses and transportation was illegal. With this, buses became integrated, and African Americans were free to sit wherever they wanted without worrying about having to give up their seat for anyone else. While many people were upset with this ruling and disagreed, African Americans were successful in their fight for equality on buses, successfully getting rid of the segregation that existed there, and getting the approval of the U.S. Supreme Court on this decision. The fight to end school segregation was one of the biggest fights the civil rights movement focused on. Schools had been following the separate but equal doctrine that was established in the Plessy v. Ferguson case in 1896, which ruled that public facilities that were racially segregated were legal as long as the facilities were equal for whites and blacks. It wouldn't be until half a century later, during the 1950s, that this decision was called into question. Oliver Brown was living in Topeka, Kansas in 1951 with his daughter Linda. She was denied entrance to the elementary school closest to their house because it was an all-white elementary school, and instead was forced to walk 6 blocks to her school bus stop to ride the school bus to a much farther elementary school that was just for African American students. Thus, he filed a lawsuit against the Board of Education in Topeka, also claiming that the schools for the black children were not equal to the schools for white children, which would violate the separate but equal clause from Plessy v. Ferguson. The case went to the U.S. District Court in Kansas, which stated that the public school segregation system was bad, but still upheld the separate but equal doctrine. Brown's case then moved on to the Supreme Court in 1952, which is where this clause disappeared. On May 17, 1954, the Supreme Court came to the decision that the doctrine of separate but equal was actually unconstitutional. Thus, segregation in schools was also considered illegal now with the overturning of the separate but equal clause, ending segregation within American schools. The overturning of the separate but equal doctrine was a monumental and important part of the African American struggle that really acted as a turning point for the fight for equality. It was after the amazing success of the Brown v. Board of Education case that we began seeing black students walk into schools that had just been for whites only. The most notable group is the Little Rock Nine in Arkansas. After the Brown v. Board of Education decision was made, the NAACP registered 9 black students to attend Little Rock Central High, which was previously an all-white school, because of their record of good grades and attendance at school. These students were Ernest Green, Elizabeth Eckford, Jefferson Thomas, Terrence Roberts, Carlotta Walls Lanier, Minnie Jean Brown, Gloria Ray Carmark, Thelma Mothershed, and Melba Patillo Beals. The students even participated in counseling sessions to teach them what to expect when classes begin and how to respond in hostile situations. They faced extreme resistance from the white community and local government. On September 4, 1957, when the school year began, the governor of Arkansas, Orville Faubus, sent out the National Guard to prevent the 9 students from entering Little Rock Central High. Along with the National Guard, there were protesters outside who yelled and screamed in their faces, preventing them from actually entering the school on the first day.
Can you tell me your name, please? Are you going to go to school here at Central High? You don't care to say anything, is that right? This girl here was the first Negro, apparently of high school age, to show up at Central High School the day that the federal court ordered it integrated. She was followed in front of the school by an angry crowd, many of them shouting epithets at her.
Within 2 weeks, federal judge Ronald Davies ordered the National Guard to be removed, and the Little Rock police took over, escorting the students through the angry mob of white protesters into the school on September 23rd. Then, President Eisenhower sent in 1,200 U.S. Army soldiers from the 101st Airborne Division from Fort Campbell, Kentucky, putting them in charge of the 10,000 National Guardsmen on duty. Finally, the Little Rock Nine were able to attend their first full day of classes on September 25th, 3 weeks after classes had officially started. The 101st Airborne and National Guard remained at Central High School for the rest of the year, but the students were able to successfully begin school and fully integrate Little Rock Central High. Even after the involvement of President Eisenhower, the Army, National Guard, and federal judge Ronald Davies, the Little Rock Nine continued to face much hostilities throughout the school year. Melba Patillo was kicked, beaten, and had acid thrown in her face while at school. Gloria Ray was pushed down a flight of stairs. Minnie Jean Brown was expelled from Central High for retaliating against the attacks, and the Little Rock Nine were banned from participating in extracurriculars. However, on May 25, 1958, Ernest Green became the first African-American graduate from Central High, where Martin Luther King Jr. was in attendance to see Ernest Green receive his diploma from Little Rock Central High, an officially integrated school. Judicially and legislatively, the civil rights movement was successful. The passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968 were monumental. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 ended segregation in public places and banned employment discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, and it is considered one of the most important legislative achievements of the civil rights movement. It was first proposed by President John F. Kennedy, but was officially signed into law by his successor, Lyndon B. Johnson. When John F. Kennedy first entered the White House in 1961, his plan was to delay supporting any new anti-discrimination measures. But with the protests springing up throughout the South and the media attention on these protests, Kennedy decided to act. In June of 1963, he proposed the Civil Rights Act, addressing the entire country on television.
If an American, because his skin is dark, cannot eat lunch in a restaurant open to the public, if he cannot send his children to the best public school available, if he cannot vote for the public officials who represent him, if, in short, he cannot enjoy the full and free life which all of us want, then who among us would be content to have the color of his skin changed and stand in his place? Who among us would then be content with the counsels of patience and delay? 100 years of delay have passed since President Lincoln freed the slaves, yet their heirs, their grandsons, are not fully free. They are not yet freed from the bonds of injustice. They are not yet freed from social and economic oppression. And this nation, for all its hopes and all its boasts, will not be fully free until all its citizens are free.
This act also stopped race, religious, national origin, and gender discrimination from employers and labor unions. Blacks could no longer be denied service or a job simply because of the color of their skin. It was because of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the Fair Housing Act of 1968 were able to be passed later on. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was signed into law again by President Lyndon B. Johnson, aimed to overcome legal barriers that prevented African Americans from exercising their right to vote. It was very difficult to vote as a young black man during that time. Blacks attempting to vote would be told by election officials that they had gotten the date, time, or polling place wrong, that they didn't have the necessary literary skills to vote, or that they had filled out an application incorrectly so they couldn't vote. They would often be forced to take literacy tests, which most failed because the African American population suffered a high rate of illiteracy due to centuries of oppression. Voting officials in southern states were also known to force African American voters to recite the entire Constitution, something most white voters wouldn't have been able to do. They went to ridiculous measures to prevent African Americans from casting their votes. But the Voting Rights Bill was passed, and Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law on August 6, 1965, with Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights leaders present at the ceremony. The act banned the use of literacy tests, provided federal assistance with voter registration in areas where less than 50% of the non-white population hadn't registered to vote yet, and allowed the U.S. Attorney General to investigate the use of poll taxes in state and local elections. Finally, the Fair Housing Act of 1968. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 prohibited discrimination concerning selling, renting, and financing of housing based on race, religion, national origin, or sex. It was passed quickly by the House of Representatives in the days after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. The Fair Housing Act was the final great legislative achievement of the civil rights era. The act was not expected to pass the House of Representatives because the House had grown increasingly conservative. However, on the day of the Senate vote, civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, where he was helping striking sanitation workers. Riots, burning, and looting occurred in more than 100 cities around the country, and President Lyndon B. Johnson increased pressure on Congress to pass the new civil rights legislation to appease them.
We can achieve nothing by lawlessness and divisiveness among the American people. It's only by joining together and only by working together can we continue to move toward equality and fulfillment for all of our people.
Johnson believed the bill would be a way to honor King and his legacy because the fight for fair housing had been something he had been involved in for years now. So, less than a week after Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, President Lyndon B. Johnson was signing the Fair Housing Act of 1968 into law. With these three acts, segregation and discrimination based solely upon race was outlawed. Legally, segregation had been successfully defeated in the United States, which was one of the most influential things accomplished during the Civil Rights Movement. They had proven their support from the President, Congress, Supreme Court, and the rest of the American government. Without these three acts, the progress that's been made in terms of racial discrimination would not exist. However, this doesn't mean that racial discrimination itself has been eliminated, which is very much not true, as it's still present in our society even today. Although the civil rights movement was very successful in achieving legal power, the struggle against racism and discrimination within communities would continue for decades to come. The Chicago Freedom Movement was created by Martin Luther King Jr., the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and other local civil rights groups working together, and it was one of the biggest failures of the entire civil rights movement, as well as Martin Luther King Jr.'s career. In January of 1966, they launched a nonviolent war on slums. Many of Chicago's black residents were trapped in these decaying and segregated neighborhoods, which were the point of entry for Southern blacks to be recruited to work in and for northern industries. The civil rights movement was largely focused on the South, but the Chicago Freedom Movement was trying to bring about social changes outside of the South with this.
If there is any doubt in anybody's mind concerning whether we have a movement here in Chicago, you ought to be in this church tonight.
Other ethnic groups were able to work their way out of the slums, but segregation kept blacks stuck in these areas. To make matters worse, rent was very high, and services within the residential areas were largely neglected as white people started leaving. When blacks began moving into buildings, white people just moved out overnight. And then, because the buildings became prominently black, the services started to go down. Landlords stopped painting, stopped doing any repairs, and anything else in the building because the conditions of the housing didn't matter anymore. Richard J. Daley, Chicago's mayor, was largely against the Chicago Freedom Movement. King had chosen Chicago to be his ground for a nonviolent campaign in the North, but as time went on, people began to question whether or not nonviolence was the best way to go about the issue. On a particularly hot day of July that year, officials closed fire hydrants in a black neighborhood, and the future of their nonviolent campaign was at stake. The leaders of the freedom movement were driving around trying to persuade the black people that their anger and aggression would not help the problem and in fact harm the movement and themselves. They would likely be physically assaulted by the police and/or imprisoned. They were able to successfully prevent an all-out riot, but shifted focus after Daley blamed the freedom movement for the events and feelings that occurred that day. They took their protest out of the slums that contained blacks and into the white neighborhoods. Although there were no signs explicitly stating that blacks couldn't live in these neighborhoods, there were reasons why only white people lived there. Blacks didn't choose to not live in these communities. They were systematically denied from living there, usually by the real estate agent. Protesters began charging realtors, banks, and insurance companies with blockbusting. This meant that homeowners in white neighborhoods were pressured to sell low and move out, and then these homes were resold to blacks at a premium. Within months, areas were changed from all white to all black. These agents were able to propagate the idea that when blacks move into white neighborhoods, the value of your house goes down. The work of the freedom movement illustrated that the segregation that existed in the North was subtle, and because of this, it could not be exposed or fought the way it was in the South. King and his staff had hoped their campaign in Chicago could be a model for others in the North, but their work in Chicago failed to win support from anyone. Although Brown v. Board of Education ruled that segregation was unconstitutional, the actual process of integrating schools was not immediate. In fact, it took a significant amount of time to actually integrate schools across the entire country. The Supreme Court passed Brown 2 1 year after the original Brown v. Board of Education ruling, addressing the practical process of integrating schools. This second ruling said that the integration process should be done at deliberate speed. However, the definition of deliberate speed was not defined, and whites and blacks had different definitions of the phrase. Because of Brown 2, barely any schools actually began integrating after the original Brown ruling. This allowed southern states to stay segregated for a significant period of time after segregation had already been deemed unconstitutional. 6 years after the case was decided, a disappointing total of only 17 schools had actually become integrated. The process of actually integrating schools across the country became very time-consuming. However, if you look at schools today, it's clear that the Brown v. Board of Education ruling wasn't enough. Segregation still exists all across the country, but it's being done in a legal way without going against what the Supreme Court ruled in the Brown v. Board of Education case. The gerrymandering of districts for black and white students ensures that most, if not all, black students in a county go to one school, and all the white students go to another school that receives more funding, better materials and equipment, more safety, and more success. In addition, school districts are often segregated by income. The connection between racial and economic segregation has worsened educational gaps between rich and poor students and between white students and students of color. And this economic disparity is the outcome of generations of oppression and poverty for African Americans. All of this leads to a furthering of the gap between black and white Americans concerning housing, healthcare, life expectancy, income, and employment, adding up to a sad and hopeless chronicle of what is supposed to be one people, one body, one country. It is obviously, in the most critical ways, two societies, separate and unequal. School segregation was a victory of law, but ultimately, a disappointment in fact. Police brutality is not something new. It's been happening since the Civil Rights era, with one of the most prominent police brutality events leading to the Watts riots. The Watts riots began because of police discrimination against an African American. The arrest and false story the police spread about Marquis Fry, the African American man who was arrested that day, was the tipping point for this community. They were worn down and tired of the police brutality and gathered at the scene, forming angry mobs that quickly led to violence. These crowds of people remained for 6 days with continued acts of violence, where rioters burned and looted businesses in the downtown Watts area, resulting in more than $2 million worth of damages. Curfews were enacted, 6,000 members of the National Guard, California State Troopers, and highway patrolmen were deployed, and they militarized the entire area in order to restore peace. Damage ranged across a 46-square-mile radius, which is larger than the cities of Manhattan and San Francisco. Grocery, liquor, and clothing stores were destroyed, but churches, homes, and libraries were left virtually untouched, illustrating that the Watts riot was not mindless. This helped to get the point across that they weren't just angry and violent. They were doing this with purpose. By the end of the riot, 35,000 adults were deemed active rioters, 72,000 deemed close spectators, 34 people had died, over 1,000 people were injured, and more than 4,000 people were arrested. And this wasn't the only riot that occurred in that time due to police brutality. The Rochester riot in 1964 began because bystanders to an arrest of an intoxicated African American man felt that the police were being too forceful and interjected themselves into the situation, throwing bottles and bricks at the police. It took 3 days for peace to be restored, and Governor Nelson Rockefeller of New York had to call out the National Guard. By the time the riot was over, 4 people were dead, 350 were injured, and almost 1,000 people were arrested. Looking at society today, we can see that these acts of police brutality are still happening. Trayvon Martin was 17 years old and wearing a hoodie. Eric Garner was 44 years old and possibly selling single cigarettes from packs without tax stamps. Sandra Bland was 28 years old and found hanging in her jail cell. Tamir Rice was 12 years old and playing with a BB gun.
The guy keeps pulling it out. It's probably fake, but you know what? He's scaring nuts.
Shots fired. Male down. Black male. Maybe 20. Black revolver, black handgun.
Freddie Gray was 25 years old and carrying a knife. Ezel Ford was 25 years old and had his hands up in surrender. Walter Scott was 50 years old and his third brake light was broken. And these are just a few in the sea of wrongful deaths. The fact that Black parents have to tell their children that they live in a country that's out to get them, that doesn't want them to succeed, and will do everything in their power to ensure they don't, is horrifying. It's clear that the civil rights movement failed to do much in regards to police brutality. The creation of the Black Lives Matter movement came to be as a direct result of the serious police brutality African Americans were facing and the many wrongful deaths occurring. This is the modern-day civil rights movement. In fact, the Black Lives Matter movement even said that they draw much of their inspiration from the civil rights movement and what they did to achieve what they were able to do. The events that were touched upon today were just a minuscule part of the civil rights movement. So, was the movement a success? Not entirely. But you cannot deny the significance of the movement and what it was able to achieve because the civil rights movement was successful in so many ways. You just can't call it a complete success. On the contrary, even with all of its failures, one can't say the movement was an entire failure either. This isn't a white or black issue with a definitive answer. The civil rights movement was successful when it came to legal equality and smaller issues like segregation on buses, but when it came to bigger issues like actually making a change in society in the way we think, they weren't able to. But the entire movement overall was the catalyst to get us started on the path towards true racial equality in American society. And the change required to reach the goal of equality isn't something that can happen overnight. It'll take time, lots and lots of time, to progress much further than from where we are now. I don't think we would be where we are today without the work of the civil rights movement and the influential leaders and figures who played a role, big or small, in this fight. Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, Rosa Parks, Ruby Bridges, Emmett Till, the Little Rock Nine. Ask any American and I can say without a doubt that they will know almost, if not everyone here listed. These influential figures changed the course of history for the better. They changed the lives of millions of Black Americans for the better. They will live in history as champions and defenders of justice, which is exactly what they deserve with the warriors we have today. Patrisse Cullors, Alicia Garza, and Opal Tometi, the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement. Ta-Nehisi Coates, a journalist for The Atlantic and author of the New York Times best-selling book Between the World and Me. Cory Booker and Kamala Harris, the first African-American senators of New Jersey and California, respectively. Barack Obama, the first African-American president of the United States, and Michelle Obama, the first African-American First Lady of the United States. And so many other activists that are still fighting for racial equality. But the fight isn't over yet. We like to believe that the civil rights movement solved all the race problems America has had, but upon a closer look, it's clear that we've still got a lot of work to do and progress to make to get there. Racism did not end in the 1960s, but when we pretend that the civil rights movement conquered racism, it's easy for people to come to this conclusion. If we tell an accurate civil rights history where America's schools remain separate and unequal, where the struggle for jobs and decent wages fail, and where there is no progress in reducing police brutality, it becomes harder to believe the fiction that King conquered racism. It becomes clear that America needs many more changes before there is equal opportunity for all. And America needs upstanders, people who are still willing to fight the fight today for anything to be done to change. The progress we've made in the change in society has already begun. More and more people are joining the fight to protect Black lives and rights. But we've still got a long way to go. We've only just begun. But we must remain hopeful for a future of change for the future to change. Like Martin Luther King Jr. said, "Everything that is done in this world is done by hope." And if he could have hope during his time, when blacks and whites couldn't use the same restroom, the same water fountain, or even sit in the same seats on the bus and still dream and fight for his dream, What excuse do we have to lose ours?
I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day. Let freedom ring, and when this happens, when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics, will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last,